Welcome back everyone to this lecture on the cast operator and cast function. The cast operator lets you convert from one data type into another. So for example, you can convert a string into an integer. Now, the important thing to keep in mind here is that not every instance of a data type can be cast into any other data type. It must be reasonable to actually convert the data. Now that term, what is reasonable, is usually pretty self-explanatory given the situation. So for example, if you have a string entry with the digit 5 and you want to cast that to an integer, that makes sense. It's quite obvious that that string 5 or that digit 5 will then be converted into the integer 5. However, if you have something more complex like the actual string spelling out 5, F-I-V-E, SQL is not going to be able to read that string, understand that English, and then convert it back to a digit integer. So as you practice more and more SQL, it should become pretty obvious what can be cast into what. But just keep that in mind. It must be reasonable to convert the data. And if you're thinking of using the cast function, you have already most likely done that calculation already in your head. So there are two main ways to actually perform a cast operation, and that is through the cast function, which is just general SQL syntax, and PostgreSQL has a specialized cast operator, which is just essentially a shorthand for a cast function call. Let's walk through first the original cast function call, the top one. Here we can see that we're simply saying select, and then within the cast function, what we're going to do is pass in the thing we want to convert or cast, then say as, and then the data type we want to cast that to. So here I'm saying cast that string 5 as an integer. The cast operator is essentially shorthand for this. Instead of having to write the cast function and the as keyword, since you're always going to be having to write that for a cast function, PostgreSQL itself has this specialized operator, which is just using two colons. So you're basically saying select and then the string 5 : to integer. Now keep in mind that typically you're not doing this on a single sample or single instance. Instead, you're going to be using this within a select query with a column name instead of a single instance. So for example, if you had a table that for some reason the date column was set up as a string entry, then what you can do is say select cast the date column there as timestamp from table. Let's go ahead and explore some examples in pgadmin. All right, here I am inside of pgadmin. Let's first show you the actual syntax calls with single instances of casting before we run it on a column. So there's, again, two ways of doing this. I'm going to say select, and then I can call cast. And what I'm going to do here is attempt to cast the string 5 as the integer data type. And notice here that the highlighting within pgadmin lets me know that I'm using the correct keywords. So I run this, and note now I get 5 back, but now it's an integer. And if I really wanted to, I could add in an alias call to call this new result column whatever I wanted, such as new int for new integer. Now, as I mentioned, it must be reasonable to actually cast this. So for some reason, you had the string 5 and you're trying to cast that as an integer. Let's go ahead and see what happens when we try to run this. Notice that PostgreSQL, if it's not able to do it, it's simply going to report back that you have an invalid input syntax. So if that happens to be the case, there's really nothing you can do as far as the cast function call. What you really need to be doing is making sure that either the thing you're trying to convert is reasonable, or if you had selected the correct data type. Now, as I previously mentioned, there's actually specialized PostgreSQL operators to essentially perform shorthand for this sort of conversion. Something to keep in mind is this is only available in the PostgreSQL engine. It's not available in a lot of other SQL engines. So what we're going to do here is basically remove that, say the string 5, : and then the data type we want to convert it to, such as integer. And note here, that's going to produce back the exact same result. So let's try it with another number, such as 10, run that again. And as I mentioned before, if you're doing something that doesn't make sense for SQL and you try to run that, it's simply going to report back an invalid input syntax. Okay, so finally, let's go ahead and explore an example use case of the cast function on a real table from our database. I'm going to select everything from the rental database, run that, And I can see here I have lots of different IDs like an inventory ID, customer ID, staff ID, and so on. Let's imagine for some reason I want to figure out the actual character length of the inventory ID, essentially asking the question, how many digits are within each inventory ID? So that's a little troublesome to do as an integer. There's no real way I can easily count the number of digits within this integer using mathematics. However, it's really easy to do with a string. I can simply ask for the character length of the string. And if I check out the documentation for string functions and operators, I know that there's a character length string right here. So character underscore length. So let's go ahead and try that out. What I'm going to do is I'm going to have to first cast this inventory ID as a variable character. So once it's a variable character, let's go ahead and run this, make sure that works. I can see that it looks the same, however, it's no longer an integer, it's character varying, which then means I can say, what's the character underscore length of this result, run that, and now it works. Notice now it's returning back an integer counting how many actual characters or digits were in each inventory ID. So that is a use case of why you may want to be using cast in order to convert data types, because you know that for certain data types, there's useful functions. If you try to just run this character length on inventory ID by itself and run that, note what happens. It's going to say that there's no function that matches the given name and argument type, essentially telling you you may need to add explicit type cast, which is exactly what we did earlier. Okay, that's it. I'll see you at the next lecture.